Who hurt you? The Korean Mafia boss asked the black waitress. What he found out shocked everyone. 30 seconds. That's all it took to shatter 4 years of careful survival. One slap, one silence, one door slamming shut behind a woman who refused to cry where anyone could see. But the moment Imani Brooks collided with a stranger on a dark Seoul street, something ancient stirred in a man feared by an entire underworld. He looked at her bruised cheek and asked 4 words that would burn down an empire just to protect her. Welcome to Unwrapped Korean Stories, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe to Lock In. The order for Table 6 came out 30 seconds late. That was all. 30 seconds on a Friday night in a kitchen already drowning in tickets. Mr. Cho didn't care about 30 seconds. He cared about looking weak in front of his investors who were sitting at Table 6, waiting. So when Imani turned from the pass with the plate in her hands, he was already moving toward her, and his palm caught the side of her face before she even saw it coming. The kitchen went quiet. Knives stopped. Eyes dropped to cutting boards. Nobody said a word because nobody ever did. Imani had worked there 14 months and she had learned the rules without anyone teaching her. You swallow it, you keep your job, you go home. Tonight, she didn't swallow it. She set the plate down with hands that barely shook, untied her apron, and walked out through the kitchen, through the dining room, past the investors who wouldn't meet her eyes, and into the cold Seoul night. She made it 3 blocks before the tears came. She didn't let herself cry inside that building, never inside. Outside was hers. She wasn't looking where she was going. That was the only reason she walked straight into a wall of a man in a dark coat, and would have hit the pavement if his hands hadn't caught her shoulders first. She looked up, sharp jaw, quiet, dangerous stillness. Eyes that found the mark on her cheek and didn't look away from it, didn't flinch, didn't pretend not to see. Who hurt you? He asked. Not loud, he didn't need loud. Before she could answer, the restaurant door banged open behind her. Mr. Cho stepped out, saw the stranger's coat, his watch, the way he stood like the street belonged to him, and somehow still found the nerve to say, "This doesn't concern you." The man in the coat looked at him for a long moment. Then he said 5 quiet words. By the end of that week, Mr. Cho no longer had a restaurant. But that was only the beginning. His name was Seo Junwoo. Imani would learn that later in pieces, the way you learn the shape of an iceberg, what shows above water first, and everything underneath much later. What she knew that night was simpler. He didn't take her to a hospital. He didn't ask permission to take care of her. He pressed a cold pack into her hand, told his driver an address, and sat across from her in a car that smelled like cedar and money, saying nothing else, as if silence were a gift he was giving her on purpose. She should have been afraid. She wasn't. There was something about the stillness in that car, no rush, no demands, no questions she had to perform answers for, that felt safer than anything she'd felt in a long time. He didn't take her home that night, not right away. He took her to a small 24-hour noodle shop near the river, ordered for both of them without asking what she wanted, and sat with her while she ate in silence, the cold pack still pressed to her cheek. "You don't have to talk," he said when she finally looked at him. "You just have to eat." It was the strangest kindness anyone had shown her in years. She didn't know yet that the man feeding her soup at 2 in the morning ran half the import contracts moving through 3 ports, that grown men changed the topic when his name came up in rooms he wasn't in. She only knew that for the first time since she'd come to Seoul 4 years ago, chasing a dream of culinary school she'd never quite afforded, then settling, then surviving. Someone had looked at her bruised face like it was a crime scene that mattered. He drove her home after. He didn't ask to come up. At her door, he finally said the only thing he'd planned to say all night. "You won't go back there." "I don't have a choice." "You do now," he said. "I'll see to it." She thought it was a kind thing men said, and never meant. She didn't yet understand that Junwoo never said things he didn't intend to finish. By the end of the week, Mr. Cho's restaurant had lost its main supplier overnight, failed a health inspection that had been randomly rescheduled for the worst possible Tuesday, and watched 2 investors quietly pull their money without explanation. Mr. Cho would spend months trying to understand what hit him. He never would. Imani didn't know any of this had a single architect. What she knew was that a new restaurant, small, elegant, 3 blocks. Imani didn't know any of this had a single architect. What she knew was that a new restaurant, small, elegant, 3 blocks from the river, called her 2 days later, and offered her a position with better pay and a manager who actually said good morning. She didn't connect it to the man from the noodle shop. Not at first. She told herself it was coincidence, because coincidence was easier to accept than the alternative, which was that a stranger had quietly rearranged her entire life in 72 hours and expected nothing in return. He started appearing after that, not often enough to feel like pressure, just enough that she noticed the shape of a pattern, a message asking if she'd eaten. A coffee left at the host's stand with her name spelled correctly, which the regular delivery boy never managed. A black car idling near her bus stop on the nights it rained, the back window rolling down just enough for him to say, "Get in, it's wet," like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. She got in, every time a little faster than the time before. They talked in that car more than anywhere else. He asked questions nobody had asked her in years, not how was work, but what did you want to be before you became what you had to be? She told him about culinary school, the dream she'd buried under rent and survival. He listened the way some people never learn to, like her answer mattered more than his next sentence. "Why does a man like you care what a waitress wanted to be?" she asked him one night, half daring him to make it about something else. He looked at her for a long moment before he answered. "Because most people stopped being curious about themselves a long time ago. You haven't." She didn't have a response for that. She just looked out the window and let the city blur past, and felt something in her chest she didn't have a name for yet. She learned what he was slowly, the way you learn a storm is coming. First the wind changes, then the sky. She learned it from the way restaurant owners straightened when he walked in. From the way his driver never once asked where they were going, because he already knew every address mattered. From the bodyguard who appeared at the edge of every room Junwoo entered and never said a single word, just watched the doors. "You're not just a businessman," she said one evening, sitting across from him at a quiet table he always seemed to get without a reservation. "No," he agreed. He didn't explain further, and she understood somehow that this was the line he wasn't ready to cross with her yet, not lying, just not yet handing her the whole truth. She decided, against every survival instinct 4 hard years had taught her, that she would wait for the rest of it. Because the parts of him she could already see, patient, exact, terrifyingly gentle with her in a world that had never been gentle with her, were enough to make her curious about the parts she couldn't. It was at a charity dinner, 3 weeks later, that she first saw the other side of him. A businessman named Director Han had cornered her near the bar, his hand resting on her arm a beat too long, his compliments sliding from polite into something closer to ownership. She was handling it the way she'd learned to handle every man who thought a smile was an invitation. Calm, firm, exit strategy already planned. She didn't need rescuing. Junwoo arrived anyway. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped between them, close enough that Director Han's hand fell away on its own, and said something low in Korean that made the older man's face go the color of old paper. Director Han left the party within 10 minutes. "I didn't need you to do that," Imani told him later, equal parts annoyed and something else she refused to name. "I know," Junwoo said. "I did it anyway." A pause. "Watching another man touch you did something to me I didn't expect. I'm not going to apologize for fixing it." She should have been angry about the possessiveness in that. Instead, something in her chest turned over, warm and unwilling. The danger introduced itself on a Tuesday, the way danger usually does, quietly, in the middle of an ordinary day, disguised as nothing at all. A man named Yang Taesung had been circling Junwoo's shipping routes for over a year, losing patience as every attempt to muscle into his territory failed. Yang didn't believe in fair fights. He believed in leverage, and leverage, he decided, had a name now. A black American waitress who'd somehow gotten close enough to the coldest man in Seoul to make him careless. Imani didn't know any of this when a car she didn't recognize idled outside her apartment for 3 nights in a row. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself a lot of things that week that turned out not to be true. She mentioned it to Junwoo almost as an afterthought, over dinner, and watched his entire posture change in real time, the warmth draining out of his face, replaced by something flat and calculating that she'd never seen directed at her before. "Describe the car," he said. She did. He didn't say anything else for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, and the gentleness of it, after the coldness she just watched move through him, nearly undid her. "You're not staying at your apartment tonight," he said. She didn't argue. Something about the look on his face told her this wasn't a negotiation. He took her to his penthouse that night, not as a line, not as a move, but because it was simply the only place in the city he trusted enough. The skyline spread out beneath the windows like something unreal. She stood at the glass for a long time, arms wrapped around herself, trying to process a day that had gone from ordinary to terrifying in the space of one sentence. "Talk to me," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "I'm scared," she admitted, the words costing her more than she expected. 4 years of surviving alone had taught her never to say that out loud to anyone. "I know," he didn't offer empty comfort, he never had. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you. I need you to believe that, even if you don't understand yet how serious I am." "How serious are you?" He turned to face her fully then, and the careful distance he'd kept for weeks. The patient, measured space of a man giving her room to breathe, finally closed. "I would burn down everything I've built before I'd let someone put their hands on you again," he said. "I need you to understand that's not a figure of speech." She should have been frightened by the weight of that sentence. Instead, standing in the quiet dark with the whole city glittering below them, she felt something break open in her chest that she'd kept locked since the night she walked out of that kitchen with tears on her face. "Why me?" she whispered. "Out of everyone you could have." "Because you walked out of that door with your head up," he said. "Because you didn't beg him to stop. Because in 4 years of surviving alone in a city that owes you nothing, you never once let it make you small." He reached up and touched her cheek, the same cheek that had been bruised the night they met, now healed, now simply hers. "I have spent my whole life being careful about everything. I have never once been careful about you. I don't think I know how." She didn't remember deciding to close the distance between them. She only remembered the warmth of his hand at her jaw, the way he waited. Even then, even with everything in him clearly straining toward her, for her to be the one who closed it. She did. What happened after belonged only to them. The quiet dark, the city lights blurring at the edges of the window, his hands careful even when they weren't gentle, her name in his voice like it meant something larger than 4 letters. When morning came, she woke up wrapped in him, and for one full minute before her mind caught up with her fear, she was simply happy. The fear arrived exactly on schedule, the way it always did with her, not loud, just patient, waiting for the good moment to ruin. She lay there as the sun came up, watching him sleep, and the same old voice started its work. "He'll wake up and regret it. Men like him don't keep women like you. You're convenient until you're not." She told herself it was protection, not cowardice, when she slipped out before he woke. She told herself a clean exit was a kindness to both of them. She left a city address with a friend across town and turned off her phone and spent 2 days convincing herself that disappearing was the strongest thing she could do. Junwoo did not see it as strength. He saw it as a door slamming in a house he'd just started to call home. He found her in 11 hours, not because he had unlimited resources, though he did, but because he refused to accept that she'd simply vanished without a reason he could fix. He stood outside her friend's apartment in the rain, no umbrella, no driver waiting nearby, just him, soaked through, waiting for her to open the door. "You don't get to do that," he said the moment she did. "Do what? Leave?" "Disappear, decide for both of us that you're not worth staying for, and run before I can argue." His voice cracked on the last word just slightly, just enough that she heard the man underneath the empire. "I have buried people I loved without saying goodbye. I am not doing it again. Not to you. Not while you're still breathing and choosing to walk away from something that isn't even broken." "I'm scared," she said again, the truth easier the second time. "I'm scared you'll wake up one day and realize I'm not worth the risk you're taking." He stepped into the doorway, soaked, unbothered by the rain still running. Down his collar and took her face in both hands. "You are the only risk I have ever wanted to take," he said. "Everything else in my life I calculated, you I just chose." She didn't have an answer that could compete with that. She didn't try to find one. She just let him pull her into the rain with him and stayed there. Yang Taesung did not wait for a better moment. Cowards rarely do. 3 days later, Imani left the restaurant alone after a closing shift, the streets quieter than usual, and didn't notice the car following half a block back until it was too late to do anything but run. She didn't get far. 2 men had her in the back seat before she could scream past the hand over her mouth. When Junwoo's phone rang 20 minutes later, the voice on the other end was calm, almost bored, the voice of a man who believed he held all the leverage in the world. You have until midnight to sign over your shipping contracts, Yang said. Or your waitress comes back to you in pieces, one at a time, so you understand I'm not negotiating. Junwoo's voice, when he answered, had no heat in it at all. That should have frightened Yang more than rage would have. You've made a mistake, Junwoo said, and it isn't the one you think, he hung up. What followed was not a negotiation. It was an unmaking. Junwoo called in every favor 4 generations of his family had banked, every debt owed to him by men who'd rather pay it than have it called publicly. By 10 o'clock, Yang's warehouses were surrounded by men loyal to interests Yang had never bothered to map. By 11, his own lieutenants had started quietly disappearing from his side, unwilling to die for a war their boss had started over a woman he should never have touched. Junwoo walked into the building where Imani was held alone. No negotiation team, no hesitation, the kind of calm that terrified people far more than shouting ever could. He found her tied to a chair in a back room, chin lifted, refusing, even now, to let them see her break. I told you, she said, voice shaking but steady underneath it, I survive. You won't have to survive this one alone, he said, already crossing the room, already cutting her free. Yang made the mistake of stepping into the doorway with a gun he didn't have the conviction to use. Junwoo looked at him the way he'd looked at Mr. Cho on that first night, unhurried, absolute, and said 4 words that ended Yang's entire operation before sunrise. You should have run. He didn't have to raise a hand. The men Yang had thought were loyal to him were already gone, and the ones still standing in that building answered to a different name now. By the time the police Junwoo's people had quietly tipped off arrived to find Yang's smuggling operation laid bare on a silver platter, Imani was already in the car, wrapped in Junwoo's coat, his hand never once leaving hers. You came, she said, half disbelief, half something warmer. I will always come, he said. There is no version of my life where I don't. By the end of the month, the story of what had happened to Yang Taesung had quietly rearranged the entire underworld's understanding of Seo Junwoo. Not as a man who tolerated threats, but as a man with exactly one weakness, and an entire empire's worth of reasons not to test it. Imani didn't return to waitressing. Junwoo didn't ask her to quit. He simply asked her one evening what she'd choose if money and fear were both off the table. She told him the truth she'd buried for 4 years. A small restaurant of her own, nothing fancy, just hers. 3 months later, she stood in the kitchen of a space he'd quietly purchased and renovated without telling her until the lease was already in her name, and cried for an entirely different reason than the night they'd met. He proposed at that restaurant, on its opening night, in front of the small crowd of people who had somehow become her people in this city that had once owed her nothing. He didn't make a speech about empires or danger or everything he'd burned down for her. He simply got down on one knee, took her hand the way he had on that very first night, and said the only thing that had ever mattered. 4 years ago, you walked out of a door with your head up and nowhere to go. I want to be the place you're walking toward for the rest of your life. Will you let me? She said yes before he finished the sentence. They married that spring, in a small ceremony by the river where their first quiet meals together had taught them both how to trust again. A year later, Imani stood in the same kitchen she now owned outright, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach, watching her husband, feared by half the underworld, gentle only and always with her, laugh with the cooks like he'd never been anything but ordinary. Love had not erased what either of them had survived. It had simply given them somewhere safe to set it down. The end.